You ever feel like life is treating you unfairly and you're dealing with a lot of shit that really isn't your fault? Well, you're right, or at least you used to be. If you ever feel like that, you're certainly not alone. There's no shortage of people walking around with all kinds of suffering and all kinds of emotional baggage, and there's also no shortage of external causes that we can point to and blame. But in this video, I want to explain one thing that I realized that made a big difference for my perspective on my own suffering. In psychology, there's a phenomenon called learned helplessness, which is when basically your victim role becomes a habit. It is when you feel imprisoned in a cage and you don't even attempt to leave that cage even if the door is unlocked. This happens to many of us because if you feel like a victim, then, well, at one point in your life, you were certainly right. As children, we are indeed victims. Like, as a baby, you just have to deal with and survive whatever circumstance you find yourself in. There's just nothing you can do. And it's true that you're a victim, and it's true that you don't have the power to change anything. And this goes on for quite a long time. Even as a child, you know, if your parents are miserable and constantly fighting and broke and getting a divorce, and your school is terrible and your teachers are terrible and so on, if you suffer from things like this, well, what are you going to do about it? You can't choose different parents, and it's not in your power to decide to go to a different school or to not go to school at all. These things really are forced upon you. And so if you had a great upbringing, then you got lucky, but if you didn't, then you really were a victim. And I think that this teaches us learned helplessness. And in many ways, we stay stuck there. We don't realize that as we grow older and as we grow more independent, we don't realize that we don't have to stay in this victim role anymore. And so what I'm seeing, and what was certainly true for my own development, is that many of us are stuck in a victim role simply out of habit, simply because that's what we learned earlier in life and we never unlearned it. My personal experience with this is that in school I had a very bad time and at least one very bad teacher, and that's where I learned this victim role, and it became a habit for me. And one of the ways in which that expressed itself later in life was in my first relationship. My first relationship was not a good relationship, not good for me and not good for her either, but I stayed in that relationship for many years. Now, why would I do that? Because I had learned to be a victim, I didn't feel like I deserved to be treated better. And it didn't occur to me that I deserved to be in a relationship that made me happy. And so I just kept putting up with a situation that made me miserable. And it's like I didn't realize that, hold on, I'm in a relationship voluntarily. I'm not stuck here like I was stuck in those situations when I was younger. I had to learn that I have the power to walk away from a relationship that isn't good for me. And this wasn't an easy lesson to learn, by the way. I also had to learn to actually use that power. And relationships is just one area of my life where I realized that this learned helplessness was really getting in the way of me becoming my best self and living my best life. But that is the important insight. It's like you can unvictimize yourself and you can learn to empower yourself beyond those old habits and those old stories that you grew up with. And if you think about it, the story of staying in a relationship, even though it's making neither me nor her happy, really is very close to that metaphor of being stuck in a cage and not escaping it even though the door is open. So much for the idea, but how do we do it? How do we actually unvictimize ourselves? Now, I'd love to make this as practical as possible and give you a quick fix for this, but all I can tell you is about what my own experience with this was. And of course, it is a process. And for me, it was a long process. But still, I think I can break this down into 3 things that helped me the most to step out of my victim role. The first is about having values, about having clear values about what do you believe in, what is important to you, and who do you want to be. If that is something where the answer to that question is a bit vague for you, I think it is worth spending time thinking about and writing about this until you gain clarity about your values. And the reason is because of the second thing, which is to establish and defend personal boundaries. Only when you have clear values can you have personal boundaries. And starting to actually enforce personal boundaries is one of the most important things that helped me step out of the victim role. You can start small with this. It can be something as simple as telling someone to take a step back if they're talking to you and they're standing too close and it's making you feel a bit uncomfortable. Putting up with that, even if it's just a small thing, of course you can tell yourself, oh, it's not a big deal, but they are making you feel uncomfortable and you're putting up with that. That puts you in the victim mode. And just telling someone, hey, can you please take a step back? That is reinforcing a personal boundary. But it also goes further into bigger and much more important things. Like, I think that a lot of people are putting up with toxic bosses and toxic workplaces, not because they have to. Like, you're not contractually obliged to have your boss be an asshole to you, right? They're putting up with it because they're in this victim role and they don't enforce their personal boundaries. And the third thing that helped me was to become a problem solver, or basically to think of my job as being a problem solver. And that is one of the things I mean when I talk about empowering people. It is putting you in a position where you're no longer the victim of problems, but you see yourself as capable of solving problems. Because yes, I strongly believe that with self-development, with all the stuff we talk about on the Icario channel, you can do a lot to become a much more capable person, to upgrade your life, to become your best self and so on. But even if you do all that, that doesn't mean that problems will go away. There will still be the same amount of problems in the world and in your life. So the difference really is one of attitude. The more you feel like you are a capable problem solver, and the more you think, this is a skill I can get good at, right? Here's a problem and I can get better and better at finding good solutions to problems. That puts you in a position of power, which is the opposite of a position of victim. So those are 3 things to do that helped me in my own development. There's also one thing not to do. When you start waking up to your own victim behavior, and maybe you look around and you see that other people have been taking advantage of you or treating you unfairly, the thing to avoid is to become resentful and vengeful, to feel like, I'm going to get back at you. And it's natural to feel that way. Initially, maybe what you'll feel is a lot of anger come up that you've ignored or suppressed for a long time. But here, I think if we give in to that anger and we start lashing out at other people, we try to make people victims who have made us victims, we try to hurt people who've hurt us, then we're just continuing the cycle of suffering and trauma. So that is my idea of unvictimizing yourself, which is, like I said, one of the things I mean when I talk about empowering people. This is one of the things I'm trying to do. This is my work. I'm trying to help people lift themselves up and empower themselves. And I hope that this video helped maybe give you a new perspective, and I hope that it sparks some interesting thoughts and interesting developments. And of course, if you have questions about this, or if you have your own story to share, I'd love to hear it. So go ahead and leave a comment.